On January 27, 1986, the Japanese company Imagineer, also known as Imagineer, was formed for the main purpose of developing, manufacturing, and selling game software in Japan. Between 1990 and 1995, they'd found success in localizing Western titles such as SimCity, Populous, and SimCity 2000. Imagineer found further success in publishing popular Japanese sports titles such as King Shokukan Night Baseball, which received a sequel of the same name, as well as their learning software series Accepted. The major problem with researching Imagineer is the lack of resources and information on the company, as well as any interviews or articles written on them that can be found, let alone in English. What we can deduce from the information that is available, however, is that Imagineer lacked any developmental experience in the RPG genre, and, for all intensive purposes, was still a relatively young game developer when the N64 released in 1996, young compared to their peers at least. In fact, their only other noteworthy developed title released outside of Japan was GT64 Championship Edition, which was met with moderate to poor reception. What's also clear is the power vacuum that appeared since Squaresoft's partnership with Nintendo ended over disagreements of Final Fantasy VII being developed on cartridge or CD, with Nintendo firmly putting their foot down that the N64 would be a cartridge system. Squaresoft would turn to the Sony PlayStation, and while Final Fantasy VII would begin its development that would go on to sell over 11 million copies to date, Imagineer would step up to the plate to put a quality RPG on the N64. While Quest 64 wouldn't sell 11 million copies, or even come close to it, it would become one of the most notorious RPGs ever released, with a perplexing development cycle to boot. In this section, we'll be examining in detail the 2-year development period for Quest 64, and the many articles written over it, both in North America and Europe. An important note I'd like to add: to show in as much detail how Quest 64 evolved over its lifespan, I found dozens of articles covering the game's development, both from North America and Europe. It's easy to become confused over the game's title since the game has had as many as 4 different titles until its release. So to help fight confusion, I've attached a page that shows what the game was named by which area over the course of its lifespan. Ultimately, it's only important that you know the game's title changes several times, so when I go from calling the game Eltale, to Holy Magic Century, to Quest 64, I'm always referring to the same game, just based on what the region called it at that time. Thank you, and enjoy the video. In January 1997, issue 92 of Nintendo Power would dedicate several pages to the 8th Shoshinkai, otherwise known as Nintendo Space World 1996, which was held the prior year in Chiba, Japan. Shoshinkai functioned as a trade show for Nintendo to unveil its newest software and hardware until the company began favoring industry-wide conferences, such as E3. Over the course of Shoshinkai's 2-day event, being November 22nd to the 24th of 1996, Imagineer would show several games, one of these being simply known as Eltale. Nintendo Power would write in their coverage article stating the game was an RPG with excellent 3D graphics, but that Imagineer only showed the game on tape, meaning there wasn't any hands-on testing during the event. There wouldn't be any images of the footage they saw teased in the rest of the article, but this is the earliest known attempt at letting the Western audience know of Imagineer's N64 RPG. The UK official Nintendo magazine volume issued in March 1997, under their preview section, would write a small blurb over a game called Magic Century Eltale, incorrectly stating Genki as the developer when it was Imagineer chief involved in the game's development. This would not be the first or last time that such an error would be made, and I should clarify that this was a common mistake made in gaming magazines at the time. For its background, they would write that while Legend of Zelda 64, referring to Ocarina of Time, is the most anticipated RPG, Magic Century Eltale could easily fill the gap for now, as the N64 still lacked any role-playing games at the time. They would go on to write that Magic Century Eltale functioned more like a traditional Nintendo role-playing game, but with a huge map and stunning 3D graphics. While they comment that they've seen some of the friends and monsters players will meet in their travels, no reference is made to whether they are referring to party members as friends, or what type of combat is implemented when encountering monsters. Images would include a boy standing outside city walls with a staff, a burst of red light being cast in a cave-like setting, and a town with a few scattered buildings. In April 1997, issue 1 of British N64 magazine, known as NGC magazine after the N64 era, included a small article covering an RPG tentatively named Crystal Stories officially for its English-speaking players, or Holy Magic Century Eltale, as it was still known in Japan. While little is written, N64 magazine writes for the game's story. Things fly off the handle a bit with religion though, which in Imagineer's world revolves around the 4 elements, earth, wind, fire, and water, along with a 5th, ethereal element. The synopsis of the story is that a young boy sets off to destroy someone, or something, called Larva, and his band of evils. To do this, the boy must become a spirit handler, and use spirits to aid him. The player would also be accompanied by 2 party members on this quest, a 13-year-old princess named Nina, and Cozy, a teenage pirate. Imagineer claims that the game will take roughly 40 hours to play through, and that the game is nearly ready, summer being the game's release frame for Japan, with no current dates for any other area's release, as no other publishers have been announced. This is the earliest time in Quest 64's development where we learn of the story's focus on the elements, the unknown 5th element, the potential of party members being included, and a vague idea of what form the story was taking. On April 4th, 1997, Tokyo Game Show would host its spring showing in Tokyo, Japan. Many huge titles would be showcased from the game industry's biggest developers, such as Konami's Suikoden, Capcom's Biohazard 2, and various Sega titles. Nintendo Power would eventually cover the show in its June 1997 issue, and oddly, while they wouldn't write what Imagineer presented at the convention, they would include 2 small pictures in the article, one showing the game's title, and the other showing a young man with a red cape standing outside of a large building, with a new interface consisting of a semicircle and a long vertical bar. I've scoured the internet trying to find footage of the game at the 97 Spring Tokyo Game Show, and have been unsuccessful, so it's impossible to say if any new features were teased, or what was covered in the game's presentation. July 1997 is also where things get a bit tricky with the game's development timeline, because it's covered by 2 different magazines, one being Nintendo Power and the other being N64 magazine, in 2 different development stages. The Nintendo Power article would be a short showcase, citing the incorrect developer and publisher for the game's US release as Konami below a screenshot of the game. THQ was the game's US publisher, and the official title for American gamers was now Quest 64. While they would write little over their hands-on time with the game, they'd note that Imagineer had a good eye for detail, and that the game sounded and looked good. The screenshot included shows a young staff-wielding boy, designed like the image shown in the Tokyo Game Show 97 article, and a woman, presumably an NPC. Most importantly, we're able to see the new user interface more clearly thanks to the screenshot they attached. The semicircle is an indicator with min and max, while a vertical bar below appears to be filling up. Both bars' representation would remain unknown, and while it's possible that they could be gauges the player controls to cast more powerful attacks, there's no evidence to back up my speculation. Ultimately, this would prove to be a short-lived UI, as after this, there would be no other images over the game's development that included the same interface. The UK-based N64 magazine would cover Crystal stories the same month, as the now titled Holy Magic Century for European players. In this issue, Holy Magic Century would be discussed in much greater depth, with a myriad of images in tow. By now, the game had made drastic improvements to its overall design. The world was much more graphically impressive, with newly textured characters and environments accompanied by fresh locations with impressive details and a lofty draw distance. Also showcased in several screenshots were the 2 additional party members, a new attractive UI, and several different monsters engaged in battle with the heroes. The article also informs us that not only do the 3 characters look different, but they play much differently from each other as well. The young main character, who the player would name, sports a flapping cloak and an old magic staff, appearing to be a standard RPG wizard. Nina, who's referred to as sassy and, I quote, moves like she's modeling on the catwalk, serves as the supportive character with some healing and defensive ability. Last is Cozy, a powerful pirate who is the muscle of the group that battles his enemies with his raw strength. N64 magazine also writes that many NPCs fill Holy Magic Century's towns and villages, each equally as distinctive as the game's scenery, which is heavily inspired by medieval Europe. Towns also include many hidden nooks and crannies, and castles with complicated elements such as bridges. Despite the great level of detail, the game is free of any hang-ups with a silky smooth frame rate. The story has also become more fleshed out as well, and while it's nothing revolutionary, there is still plenty to enjoy as a fan of JRPGs. Spirit handlers are those who control the 5 magical elements of the world, but misuse of the spirit's power has created the evils, who feed off man's 7 deadly sins. With this evil loose on Earth, both men and monsters' sins dramatically increase. The player will lead a young spirit handler who is a direct descendant of a magic crystal, presumably a crystal of one of the elements, which helped keep the evils in check long ago, by granting 3 sacred swords to chosen heroes. It looks like history is repeating itself, as the young boy, Nina, and Cozy use their varying abilities to defeat the evils, as well as the spirit handler turned evil villain Larva, who is somehow responsible for all the wrongs going on in the world. N64 also writes a few other details about the game's design and its characters. At this stage, Imagineer had incorporated a C button-based spell system, allowing spells to be selected and combined on the fly. The UI is much different now too. In the upper left-hand corner, there is an MP bar with a spell selection prompt beneath it. Additionally, whether shown only when prompted or when combat is initiated, there's a vertical HP bar that I believe was the currently controlled character's HP. I say currently controlled character because there isn't an image where more than one of the game's 3 characters is on screen at once, so I can only assume that one character is under direct control at a time, and perhaps the player swaps between one of the heroes on the go, a system not uncommon to traditional role-playing games. There's also a shot of the game's option menu, which included such settings as cursor, message speed, spell speed, and a help option. In this stage of the game, we learn from the next article that combat was in fact real-time as well. On the last page of the article, N64 magazine gives a few additional details of the game's main, playable characters. The hero the player names is a kind of wizard, and while little else is known about him, he's a talented spirit handler, and only 12 years old. This character not only uses magic of the elements, but also possesses a sword which might reference one of the swords that's given by the spirit crystal in the game's story. Princess Nina is introduced as a 13-year-old, and is skilled at defensive and healing magic alongside her arrows. Finally, Cozy the Pirate is claimed to be the sheer power behind the group, apparently lacking in magic but making up for it in strength with his fists and his sword. It's uncertain whether Cozy's sword is one of the Swords of Light, given by the crystal as well. If it is, then while the hero and Cozy both have swords, Nina is the only playable character listed without one, which could mean that there might be an additional party member with the third sword the player meets later, or perhaps one of the evils, or larvae, somehow came into possession of one. This is around the time when hype for Holy Magic Century was really starting to rev up. If anything, it was a fantastic looking game with some tantalizing features. Considering the N64 lacked an authentic RPG experience that begins and ends with leveling up your characters, destroying monsters, and saving the world, the game was not only unique, but appeared to be quite polished as well. However, this is also where the game's continuity in its development starts to become extremely confused. The next earliest article was covered in UK-based Nintendo magazine August 1997. After everything we'd learned from the N64 magazine, and the huge leaps and bounds the game had made graphically and technically, this article would show images of the game in its very early development stage, similar to when the game had been discussed with the title Crystal Stories. Additionally, they'd write that the player takes control of the young man named Jean-Jacques. It's unknown why an earlier stage of the game was covered, so much later in its development cycle, as well as why conflicting design choices would be shown. But this wouldn't be the first or last time this happened over the course of the game's development, further confusing how well the game's development was actually going. The following month, UK Nintendo magazine would cover the now titled Magic Century Eltale once more, this time with images of the game in its much more recent state, with similar features discussed in the prior N64 magazine. There are a few new interesting developments as well, such as the game's camera having the ability to zoom in and out at great distances, although it's stated that this feature needs more work. Also, this is the first article that shows the game's departure from basic level up prompts, and features certain stats increasing based on what the player is currently doing. For instance, an image shows the player character running outside with the text AP up appearing over his head, which could be an early version of prompt for an agility point increasing. Interestingly, this article shows just how different the game's combat was compared to the final version of the game. Random encounters would occur when traveling outside of towns, and monsters would pop up in groups to attack the hero in real time. It appears that most monsters attempted to swarm or surround the hero, but it's unknown whether they used magic, physical attacks, or both. Without footage of the combat, it's difficult to say how well this system worked, but there is no indication that it functioned poorly. The article briefly goes over the elemental spells the hero can cast, being wind, water, earth, and fire, and without the mention of the game's fifth element, it can only be assumed this idea was trashed for good at this stage of the game. On one of the game's menus, however, a bar called Ether is shown nearly half filled. This could be some reference to the fifth ethereal element stated before, but I have no data or statistic to prove this. The four elements that are still included, however, appear to have gone through some cosmetic changes, as there is a large boulder hovering over the hero's head in one photo, as well as 3 ice crystals surrounding an enemy in another. The final interesting thing to note is the return to focus on the game's day and night cycle. The crude display in the bottom right of the screen shows what time it is based on a 24-hour clock. The important thing to note was at this stage, UK Nintendo magazine writes that NPC's behavior was impacted by the time of day. For instance, if you hang around the pub at closing time, villagers will be drunk, and NPCs kept to their own schedules depending on the time of day. By December 1997, the game developed even further, this time being the cover of GameFan magazine's December issue, with several pages being dedicated to its development up to this point. At first glance, the most noticeable features are a few new environments and new spell effects, along with a now more traditional looking HP and MP bar bordering the upper left corner of the screen. Imagineer also informs GameFan that the game is being written specifically for the Western audience. The storyline, characters, and locales will all vary from the Japanese version." End quote. NPC characters keeping to schedules based on the time of day and the game's shift from day to night is mentioned once more, along with battles occurring randomly when traveling outside of towns. GameFan further writes how gorgeous the game is, and can tell by some screenshots that the player is still able to control how far the camera can zoom out as well. Interestingly though, the game lacked any decent sound designs at this point, with GameFan writing, "A mere 2 garbled musical sections were available for this preview, so I won't even comment on this aspect." End quote. The last aspect they would write is that at this stage of the game, a sequel was already being scheduled, and that Quest 64 would only be a part of the game series. Little other new ground is covered, and while both Nina and Cozy had received some big design overhauls, there were not any 3D representations of their in-game models shown. Skepticism returns with the coming of the new year, January 1998. N64 magazine dedicated a small article to Holy Magic Century, discussing the status of the game's completion and the progress that had been made so far. At this time, Imagineer claimed that the game was 60% done, despite the game's March launch date a mere 2 months away being the expected release time. They would go on to write that either the development figure is a gross underestimate, or we can expect some fairly heavy release date slippage. In addition, while they write that interior locations are handled well, the game's still as far off as ever. On top of this, the UI returned to its original display that was teased all the way back in July. What was happening with Holy Magic Century, and why were so many design choices being reverted once more? Why was there still no new gameplay of Nina or Cozy since July 1997? How is the game only 60% done, yet expected to release in only 2 more months? The game was originally slated for a Japanese release the summer of last year, so what's been holding the game up? Questions were beginning to rise, and Imagineer had some serious explaining to do, an explanation that fans would never receive. Both hope and doubt would come in Nintendo Power's March 1998 issue. Several well-designed pages were dedicated to Quest 64, including fresh features and a new window for its release. First, Quest had, once again, changed its UI, this time sticking with traditional stacked HP and MP bars, what appears to be a compass attached to the bars, and 4 different colored gems at the bottom left of the screen with an associated number attached to them. Also, battles showed colored rings around both the player, now named Jack, and monsters, indicating the biggest change in combat we'd seen over the course of the game's development, as combat was now turn-based. Menus had an overhaul as well, one showing Jack's magic levels and experience bar, as well as a new interface for spell selection. One of the pages is dedicated to a short explanation of Quest 64's new story. Nintendo Power writes, "Long ago, the kingdoms of Keltland lord over the Eltale book. One kingdom eventually took the magical tome, and ruin befell the land. It was called the Day of Grief, and only the efforts of a great wizard restored the balance. 1,000 years have passed, and a thief stole the book from the monastery. It's up to Jack to recover the book, look for his lost father, Lord Bartholomew, collect the 4 elemental orbs of power, and overcome all odds to avoid a second day of grief." This would end up being the final direction the story took before the game's release, with only certain terminology and location names being changed until that time, as well as the main character's name changing from Jack to Brian in the North American version. Once again, there aren't any screenshots of Princess Nina or Cozy the Pirate, and Nintendo Power writes, "Many items and characters have yet to be added, such as Jack's 2 companions," which is a huge red flag, as it's been months since we've seen either character in any action, or even screenshots, during their further development. Power goes on to write that NPC interaction is important, and carried out via text box dialogue, which allows players to buy items, or stay at an inn overnight. In the final version of the game, There was no buying and selling of goods as there was no currency, and that staying at the inns was a free service. And since it wasn't directly stated that there's a currency system, I'm willing to give Nintendo Power the benefit of the doubt, and that they were misinformed by Imagineer. The newest feature Power claims was being developed is the way the player may travel the world. They write that, when you find a horse, you might as well climb aboard and gallop off. Horses can be found in different locations in Keltland, rested and ready for passing heroes. You'll also find a serious seagoing ship in Quest 64, which will take you to mysterious shores. While Imagineer promised new ways to travel the world, there were yet to be any implementations on how to keep track of where you are. As THQ states, they hope to include an on-screen map to help out. Anyone that had been keeping up with Quest 64's development up to this point had reason to be very suspicious. By now, we'd been promised a story tailored specifically towards a Western audience, 3 playable characters, all with unique playstyles and combat rules, a world where NPCs have their own set of schedules depending on the time of day, challenging puzzles, hidden nooks and crannies and rewards around every corner, a world filled with hundreds of unique characters, horse riding, ship sailing, and upwards to 40 hours of gameplay. Yet we've seen the story change several times. We haven't had any gameplay or footage or even images of our party members in nearly a year. We've yet to hear details on the schedules NPCs keep. We haven't seen a single puzzle since the vast majority of gameplay we've seen revolves around combat, and the newest additions we've heard of is the player may ride a horse or sail a ship, but there were no images of any character actually performing this action. All of this, and the game is slated to be out very soon. In times of desperation, consumers are willing to overlook many red flags, and considering we still act an RPG since Quest 64 had been unveiled at Shoshinkai over 2 years ago, many were hoping that the game would live up to its lofty expectations. When Quest 64 had its first release in July of 1998, North America was their first to have their hands on the title. The game was a commercial success. It sold well for its first couple weeks. As reviews began rolling in, and word of mouth caught on, however, sales slowed down as the hype plummeted and public opinion soured. Reviewers were making claims that the game had many of its features stripped. In fact, the game was so bare bones that outside of a few positives at a technical level, it was at best mediocre, and at the worst, riddled with failed design. There were some outlets that gave the game a much more positive response, France and Germany being the most noteworthy after the game's European release on September 30th, 1998. But even if some agreed Quest 64 wasn't a bad game, it was still a massive disappointment. In the US, Nintendo Power itself would only give the game a 6.3 out of 10, noting constant fighting was tedious and that the game needed more things to do, more items, more side plots, and more puzzles. In terms of the final version stripped features, Nina and Cozy were gone, instead serving as NPC characters in a story that many claimed was inaccessible or barely patched together. There was no Sword of Light given to the main hero, and his only means of defending himself was by pummeling enemies with his staff or casting an assortment of spells. Combat itself occurred much too frequently, and was the focus of gameplay too often, burning players out quickly, especially due to its grindy nature. There was no currency system whatsoever, the game lacked any puzzles outside of navigating dungeons with a few multiple pathways. The only methods of player-controlled travel was either on foot or by use of item or spell. The game was as few as 15 hours long, the camera was mediocre at best, without any capacity to zoom in or out, and NPCs didn't keep to any set schedules, and would have the same dialogue and action no matter the time of day. Dozens upon dozens of rooms were empty, some areas in the game remained unfinished, death had no real impact on player experience, and the ending was borderline insulting at both a storytelling and technical level. Understandably, many felt they'd been lied to. Imagineer overpromised, and the game was pushed out much too early, despite an already bloated, confused development cycle. While both North America and Europe had nearly identical versions, outside of different titles and in-game names, the Japanese version attempted to make some amends to the game's design to improve the overall experience. First, you could save the game without a save cartridge, which had been a huge issue for those that rented the game or bought the game without one, as it was impossible to save your progress. Leveling also occurred faster and more frequently, with a certain color shrouding the main character each time its corresponding stat increased, so the player didn't need to constantly check the menu for their stat levels. Critical hits were also featured, and monsters dropped items more frequently, while defeating bosses granted more stat points, giving a bonus to the player's MP as well as HP. Most important, the game's ending received a huge overhaul, with certain plot-important characters having lengthy dialogues to explain more about them and how they feel about the hero and the game world. By the time of its release, however, it was far too late. Even if the fixes had been substantial enough to justify the cost, the game, known as Eltale Monsters in Japan's final release, tanked, selling nowhere near the amount of copies sold in North America or even Europe. While the series would have 2 Game Boy titles, one a remake of the N64 release, and the other a simple puzzle game with similar monsters, the official sequel to the game had officially been cancelled, and the Quest series was slated for a swift, silent death. These days, Imagineer is still active, most recently with the release of Japanese Switch titles Little Friends and Fit Boxing, smartphone games such as the relatively popular Sumi Sumi Matari puzzle, and their Metabots merchandise. However, there hasn't been a reference to Eltale since its final release, along with the release of its Game Boy titles, as Imagineer has moved on to bigger things since the failed RPG franchise. Looking over the company's historic timeline, there isn't even a single reference or mention of the game's development or release. When Ocarina of Time came out only a few months later, there was no reason to remember what did so little and failed the expectations of so many, and so, the books finally closed for good on Imagineer's role-playing game. Surprisingly, despite the major backlash it received, Quest 64, Holy Magic Century, or Eltale Monsters all live on to this day thanks to the endearing spirit of the speedrunning community, the few that enjoyed the game still singing its praises, or to the backlog of hate it's received in reviews over the years as one of the worst games of all time. Initially, I was going to skip the development section of this study, as I wanted to dive directly into the problems people had with Quest 64, instead of focusing on what I felt most either wouldn't care about or already knew. However, the more I researched, the more I realized Imagineer had, at least at some point, wanted to develop a truly incredible game. And while it wouldn't live up to its hype, expectations, or features, this all leads to one indispensable point. Though riddled with issues, the game has moments of magnificence buried within its design, and I feel the reason there are those that genuinely enjoy this RPG is because they've managed to catch these passing moments which would have otherwise been buried beneath its many faults. As we forge ahead to Part 2, we'll look at one of the game's greatest attributes, the lore. Thank you for your continued viewership, and I'll see you in Part 2.